Game 6 of the World Chess Championship just finished up, and we just witnessed one of the greatest duels that we have ever seen in a World Chess Championship, in my opinion. How did it end up? Carlsen was white. Just a forewarning, this game is the longest game to have ever taken place in a World Chess Championship. This will be a very basic sketch, because to properly cover this game, this video would be 3 or 4 hours long. As usual, the game notes will be in the comments. Check those out, but I will be focusing on only the very main parts of the game. Carlsen was white. We started with d4. In my opinion, that's Carlsen signaling he's ready for a fight. It's much easier to get complications in 1d4 nowadays. And this showed in the game. He sat down looking for a fight. Knight f6. Knight f3, sort of an interesting move order. He had some specific prep in mind, which he showed later in the game. d5, g3. So c4, of course, would take us to either a Queen's Gambit or a Catalan. g3, Carlsen's looking for something very specific and slightly offbeat. e6 was played. I'd like to highlight one interesting part of my repertoire. This was recommended by Avrok in his Fighting d4 Sidelines tome. I quite like this as black, just because it's very combative and aggressive. It's immediately cutting down on the c4 pawn break from white, and tries to make white not regret making this move order to begin with. And theory branches from here in several different directions, but I quite like this as black. It's not better for black, to be sure, but I don't think it's worse for black either. I think it leads to a much more interesting and balanced fight than the usual Catalan or Catalan-style position. But e6 is quite solid. e7, b5 would be the same sort of option. It's very clear that Nepomniachtchi is looking to play as solid as possible. We have definitely not seen that aggressive fighting Nepomniachtchi so far in the match, and that's showing in his choice of openings as well. Castle, c4 would head directly back into the Catalan, so obviously Carlsen is looking for something else. And b3, and apparently this is what Carlsen was looking for. So obviously this prep is not looking to set the world on fire, but it's slightly offbeat. It's looking for complications. Of course, c4. This would be the course of game 2, where we saw Nepomniachtchi play b5, and we saw a humongous brawl after white played knight e5. I'd be interested to know why Carlsen wanted to avoid this, whether it was just looking for something slightly different, or he had some specific analytical problems in finding an advantage from here. Because the standard move here, a4, seems to do pretty well for white. But that's neither here nor there. b3, definitely offbeat. I don't think objectively it's an edge for white, but it leads to something away from the beaten path at least. c5, very logical move. b5 would actually make some sense here, looking to punish the c4 break. And I think black is doing okay here. It's not as good as some other versions of the b5 push from black, but I think black is doing okay. But c5 is certainly the most solid. dx c5, c4. So this is what Carlsen had in mind. Of course, bishop b2, this would be way too slow. And this is suddenly a really bad Benoni for white, because this bishop on b2 is going to be biting on granite after e5. But c4 immediately hits back at the center. dc4, queen c2. So white didn't play that to get an isolated pawn on c4. And knight bd2, and this is a fun little idea. It's nothing revolutionary, of course, but it's a slightly offbeat and unique idea on move 10, which you rarely see at top-level chess. White's offering a pawn, and he's looking for the initiative in return. I actually think he does get the initiative. Black goes with it. I think this is a really good Benko-style position for white. I think white has full compensation for the pawn. At the very least, the fact that black's development is so far behind makes white very comfortable with this. Nepomniachtchi very solidly played knight c6. And then b5. I think Nepomniachtchi actually deserves a bit of credit for playing this move. It's the move designed to neutralize white's play the most, but it is a little bit of a dangerous move, especially on this exposed long diagonal. e5 would be about as equal in terms of value as b5, and it's also more complicated. This would be the move that Nepomniachtchi would play if he were looking for a win or complications. The main line here. And this is a very complicated position. I think both sides can be reasonably happy here. But this is certainly more complicated than the game. B5 liquidates things down fairly quickly. Knight b4, this is force. Black needs to have seen this before he played that move. If he plays bishop b7. And white's just got the huge advantage of the bishop pair for free. This is a humongous edge for white. So knight b4 is forced, but it's completely adequate to equalize. And then bishop b7, just in time to take over the long diagonal. Or at least fight for the long diagonal. Knight d3, I think this shows that Carlsen came to the game today looking for complications. Bishop e5, this would be the way to simplify down if he wanted it. But knight d3 actually aims for a little bit in the position. Aims for this sort of quasi-outpost on c5. And Carlsen takes a risk here. He gives up the bishop pair in the hopes of imbalancing the position. So it hurts black's pawn structure over here, and it perhaps looks to aim at this quasi-outpost on c5 eventually. I think Carlsen's actually taken a little bit of a strategic risk here, but it shows that he came looking for a fight today. Knight d4, I think we do have to recognize that, I think of the criticism that we've heard in the past few days about World Championship chess. People have been ragging on Carlsen. I think Carlsen's consistently been the one looking to complicate the play this entire match. In half the games now, or more than half the games, he's offered a pawn sacrifice to ready initiative. And it's been Nepomniachtchi playing in safety mode, looking to neutralize the position above all else. Carlsen's doing his best to complicate the play. I'm going to fast forward a lot. So this would be a key moment. Rook d2. Rook ac8, this completely changes the position. Now, white's got two rooks for the queen. Here it's still balanced because these queenside pawns are quite weak, so this gives black his own share of the play. Bishop b2, this is an error. Queen b3 would be better. Rook c5. Rook d1, this is a huge mistake. Rook c2 is better. And all of a sudden, white's getting this humongous attack out of nowhere. And it starts with the fact that the knight's able to shift itself over to the king side with tempo, and both these pieces are stuck on the queen side, while all the action is going to happen on the king side. This will suddenly be a decisive attack out of nowhere for white. Rook d1, a bit too lackadaisical. Bishop xb4 was better here. And after something like a3, I think rook a7 might be forced. Black for sure is in the driver's seat here. e5, a little bit too indirect. Rook c2, that justifies e5. e4 would be better. That looks like it holds the worst side of a draw. Queen d5, it has to be said that we were coming close to the time control here, and both players were a little bit low in time, so these mistakes in a complicated position were quite understandable. Queen d5, not the best move. Bishop xb4, again, just in these sorts of positions, playing directly is usually rewarded. Black just takes the pawn, gets ready to push the a-pawn. Queen g4, and this is simply much better for black. Black's got this passed a-pawn that'll stretch white's position, and he also has this weakened king side that he can aim against. So he has two sides of the board in which he can play. That should stretch white to his breaking limits. So rook dd2, that eliminates the pin of the knight. It prepares to move it somewhere else. Rook a2. e4 is a big strategic mistake, giving up that outpost on f4. f5 is better. And then f4 is in time to expose the white king. This should lead to a perpetual. e4 gives up a bunch of outpost squares for the knight to jump to. Knight xe4. Rook dc2 is sort of a paradoxical move in some ways, but actually black's completely paralyzed here. Knight xa4, we get the piece back with the pin. And with care, white should actually win this without a humongous amount of trouble. The two rooks are much stronger than the queen here. Eventually, white will be able to enforce the win of one of these pawns and trade queens off for the two rooks and win the pawn ending. 5. Knight f4, so the knight's able to establish itself in this very strong outpost. We're going to fast forward through a lot of these moves. This game is the longest game ever played in World Championship history, so to go over every single move would be a humongous burden. Analysts are going to be dealing with this game for literal months, so for a quick roundup like this, it'd be inappropriate. I mean, the video would be 5 hours long at least. But we see some maneuvering here. Bishop a7 was a little bit inaccurate. Bishop c7 is better here, keeping the bishop a bit better placed. And white's able to finally force something. So we reach this position, and this position is still a draw. But this is white playing for 2 results only. So white has a rook, a knight, and 2 pawns against the queen. And black has no winning chances whatsoever here. This is a position where white can just purely push forever with absolutely no risk. That is something that Magnus Carlsen is the absolute king of. And this is exactly the sort of position that I would say Nepomniachtchi wouldn't want to get into before the match. I would say that Nepomniachtchi was looking for complicated positions, attacking positions, where he can use his skill at aggressive tactical sequences. This is exactly the sort of position that Carlsen excels at. So I'm surprised that in the course of the match, Nepomniachtchi has been consistently simplifying down to apparently a position like this, because this is the sort of position that Carlsen can just milk forever. So we see some maneuvering. Some of this is to gain time on the clock. Some of this is to try to figure out the most appropriate configuration for his pieces. Knight g5 is a mistake. You need to play knight e1 here. King g7 is a little bit of a mistake. King e7 is better. This keeps the king a little bit better placed. We see a lot of shifting here. And now Carlsen finds what is, in my opinion, the most challenging arrangement for his pieces. So the knight on e2 protects the rook on d4, and the rook on d4 is there to guard the e4 pawn once it pushes to e4. The knight on e2 also blocks any checks on the second rank. So here on e2, this knight is almost perfectly placed because it glues white's entire position together and allows white to finally safely push that e-pawn up the board. That's been his main idea. So we finally see the e-pawn push. This resets the 50-move rule, of course, for those of you unfamiliar. If we don't see a capture or a pawn move within 50 moves, that automatically makes it a draw. But whenever you see a capture or a pawn move, that resets the counter. Rarely comes up in play, except for like scholastic play, but you do occasionally see it. E4, just more shifting. Now that white's played e4, he can go back to maneuvering for a mistake. So queen x h4. This actually enters table-based territory. So for those of you unfamiliar, for a certain amount of pieces, so here that would be 2, 4, 6, 7 pieces, computers are advanced enough that they've done analysis on certain amounts of pieces, and we've codified that analysis into a database where we can just look up, if there's a low number of pieces on the board, we can just look up what the result should be. So this exact position for 7 pieces is in a database, a 7-piece database, and this is a draw. Now, again, when you're looking at this with a computer in a table base, and you've got Stockfish giving you the evaluation, it's incredibly easy to say that. This is a very difficult position to hold for anyone, against anyone. Playing against Magnus Carlsen with the clock ticking for the World Championship, holding this, in my opinion, is at least subjectively very difficult, if not impossible. White can just play this sort of position forever, and he can just fish for a mistake forever. I'd be willing to bet that Carlsen would be happy to play this position for 250 moves, just trolling for that decisive error. And to hold this just against constant pressure and constant maneuvering is just an impossible task. I certainly can't name anyone in chess history that I can imagine could complete that, except maybe Magnus Carlsen, but he wouldn't be playing himself. So theoretically this is a draw, but practically this is very difficult for black. Queen a5, I do think queen b6 is a little bit better. Allowing the queen to lift to h6 looks a little bit more useful than allowing the queen to lift to h5, but just a small detail. The table base still has this as a draw. Queen b7. This is the first genuine misstep. This misplaces the queen fairly badly. Queen d1 is better. Just keeping the queen in position to harass white's pieces much better. Queen d4. And this keeps the black queen centralized. Of course, the white pawns are still well under control in this position. This still looks like a draw for black. But queen b7, and of course I don't think Carlsen would have pushed his pawn so directly. He would have continued maneuvering for an error first. But queen b7 looks like a genuine error. This allows white to lift his rook over the pawns and then play e5. And this is much different because here the rook on f5 is cutting off the black king from the king side. The knight on g3 is doing a wonderful job protecting both the rook and shielding the white king from any checks. So now the white king has a plan of lifting over to the king side in conjunction with moving these pawns forward. This looks very strong for white. And then queen e6, this is the decisive error. This is where I would say black is objectively lost, finally. Queen b1 looks best. Queen c2, and this keeps the black queen much more flexible. It can still check on h7, it can check on h2, and it's staying in the background to help harass these white pawns. Queen b2, and immediately hitting that pawn on e5 now that's undefended. And black is holding so far in this position. Again, in this particular position, I don't think Carlsen would push f5 so quickly. He would continue to maneuver and troll for an error, because that's one of the basics of good technique. Queen e6 should be decisive. I think black is objectively losing now. And knight h5, and now white's pieces are starting to swarm in on the black king side. This is decisive penetration. The black queen, in some variations, is actually getting trapped. If king e7, rook g5, and just like in the game, the white pieces are forming this perfect shelter for the white king. There's no way to get perpetual against the white king because everything is blocked out. And white can just arrange an effective way to push his pawns forward. Queen h7 was played, but this is going for black. e6, this is a beautiful way to convert. Of course, if queen xf5, we get the black queen. So king d8 was played, but this allows the rook to lift into decisive position. f5, there are prettier ways to win, but with the clock ticking and the title on the line, this is the surest and the most solid way. This is the correct practical choice. And Nepomniachtchi resigned after queen g1 before white could play knight g7. Basically, the idea is there is a shelter waiting for the white king on g8, and then white just finishes things off by playing the e-pawn forward. So, incredible game. I think one of the best games ever played for the World Championship. Credit needs to be given to both players, but I think more of the credit needs to go to Carlsen. He showed up today ready for a struggle, and at every point where Nepomniachtchi tried to take some tension out of the position, Carlsen was there to sort of struggle and try to keep tension in the position. And once Carlsen reached the sort of position at which he excels, he did not give up and he didn't stop trolling for an error until he got it from Nepomniachtchi. This is why Carlsen is the best in the world. He has been the best in the world for years. And until someone comes along that can hold up against that sort of endgame pressure, I don't think he's unlikely. I don't think he's likely to be taken off that throne for quite a while. This was an extraordinary performance. So exactly the sort of performance we've been waiting to see from Carlsen. So Game 7's tomorrow. Carlsen actually has white again. So Nepomniachtchi had better forget this game really quickly and get a good night's sleep, because I have a feeling Carlsen's going to bring the hammer and tongs tomorrow as well. So we'll see you then.